Welcome back to Communicology. Today we're going to talk about something that's a bit of a sensitive topic, but that's okay because we should be afraid to wander into topics that are maybe a little bit, controversial. And it's okay to do so because, frankly, it's important to have these discussions. And that is the concept of race swapping characters in television and movie productions. Now, what this means basically is if you have a character in your TV or movie, your TV show or movie is of one race, and you basically hire an actor from a different race to cover that character in that production. Now, there's all kinds of discussion about this going on right now because there is a casting of a black man who's a very fine actor, and he was put into the production of Harry Potter, the TV show that has been put together from HBO Productions. So Papasuitu, again, very fine actor, but he was pegged to play the role of Severus Snape, who is very much so portrayed as white in the books, and of course was played by Alan Rickman in the movies. So, why is this a big controversy? Well, on one side of the issue, you have a lot of people who are saying things like this should never happen. You should always stay true and faithful to the material. And there are people on the other side of the issue that say, what does it matter if the character, if the actor is a quality fine actor, what's the point? Because actors pretend to be people all the time. So, and those are both legitimate issues, and we should tackle them and look at them. Now, why, wouldn't it, when we talk about it not mattering, let's talk about that, because there are some cases like you see in, obviously in Marvel productions, you see lots of race swapping in that. Nick Fury, played by Samuel L. Jackson, is supposed to be a white guy. And you also see Falcon, played by Sam Wilson, who's supposed to also be, Sam Wilson, the character, is portrayed by, a black man in that. And it's one of those things where we just say, well, that's fine. Does it affect the characters or how they're portrayed? No, they work just fine. I mean, Samuel Jackson plays a fine Nick Fury. He has the attitude of the character right. The way he portrays him is right. And it seems to go just fine. And that's not a problem. The problem comes whenever you see changes to the actual character and how they're, portrayed throughout the story and how it affects the story. So that's why I think you see a lot of problems with the idea of Papasuitu being, picked for the role of Snape, because quite frankly, we see a huge problem with that one because, first and foremost, HBO had made it very clear from the beginning that they were working to do a faithful adaptation of the books. Well, a faithful adaptation of the books means a faithful adaptation of the book. So how is Snape described in the books? He's clearly white. He's listed pale multiple times with long, greasy black hair and with a hooked nose. And, he's multiple times through multiple books mentioned how pale he is. So that's fairly straightforward. Well, what's the problem? Couldn't he be played by a black actor? Technically, yes. Narratively, no. And it becomes a really big problem because when you start changing the outcome of the story, things really come into play as a problem. For example, just think of little basic things, like when Neville has to face the boggart, what's his biggest fear? His biggest fear is that a black man is going to come out of the closet. That's going to be really awkward. Or even worse, when James Potter and his mates decide to pick on Snape, they bully him and eventually string him up in a tree. Imagine what that looks like. A group of white kids stringing up a black guy in a tree. It doesn't take much to realize that instantly changes the narrative of the story. And then also, look what they do to Snape. I mean, they have him basically simping after Lily Potter the whole time, only for Lily to ditch the black guy to go after the white guy who's been lynching him. That's a major problem in this story. Not to mention all the ideas that go through, how, J.K. Rowling did a good job of handling issues of bigotry without using modern terminology for it. I mean, they focused heavily on the idea of the purity of the witch world, versus the wizard and witching world, or you have muggles on the outside and the way that they view them, and not to mention the dangerous problem of having mudbloods, people who are mixed race. And they never used that term, but boy, it's pretty obvious what she was talking about. Well, now they're going to make it look very obvious by having Snape in there too. And when Snape starts ranting about how awful it is that they're mixed race people, how do you think that's going to look? So you can see where narratively it creates a humongous problem. And that is an issue that we should, work to avoid. Because whenever you're creating a story, it's important that you have your characters fleshed out, that you have your plot points figured out, and that all comes under the umbrella of the theme that goes across the entire production. What is the theme of the show? What is the major thing that we're trying to teach people, to help them know, to help them understand, to help them learn? And, you can see obvious themes in the Harry Potter world. You can see things like friendship. You can see things like the idea of color blindness when it comes to the idea of accepting mudbloods. There's a point where one of the house elves, grumbles very heavily. From the black family, one of the house elves grumbles about how Harry Potter is the friend of purebreds and mudbloods alike. We see Harry as the hero because he can see people beyond just their composition and to who they are as people. And those are major themes that we see. And we're going to see Snape coming in very much, railing against all these kind of things. And then, of course, we're going to find out later that he actually is the half-blood prince. What are we supposed to do with all of this? And it creates all of these crazy things that they're going to have to work with and change and affect in the story. So you can see in this situation, it creates crazy amounts of damage. Now, one of the other problems that comes along with this is when we start seeing changes of actual people in the world, because they say, hey, we can just, as long as it's a competent actor, right, we can have them do any of this work they want. So there was a recent Netflix, work on Anne Boleyn, who was very much a real person, a white woman who was replaced with a black actress. And then Joan of Arc had the same kind of treatment. And there have been numerous other ones. In fact, it's become a meme now for Netflix. So whenever there's a new production being made from something, there's always a meme of a Netflix adaptation where like all the characters are race swapped or gender swapped or something, instead of just leaving it as it is. And the upcoming X-Files reboot is getting the same basic kind of treatment. They kept the genders the same, but they replaced the races of both main characters who were white in the TV show. Now, those aren't, of course, those are fictional characters, but still the idea is it's being done an awful lot. And that leads to a big question of why. Why would you do it? Is it specifically because we're just trying to have a more varied, representative society? Well, the people who are in favor of doing that say, yes, it is. But the downside with that is when you switch it for everyone all the time, it becomes a trope and it no longer seems realistic. If white people make up the majority of the population in the United States, it's normal to see white people in things. But they've gone so far in Hollywood that they've erased white people. And if you watch your TV shows and your movies, it's not uncommon at all that if there is a white person, they're either incompetent or they're the bad guy. And you'll see that portrayed a lot. And that's dangerous because they've gotten themselves tied up into a twist of, well, we could have this really complex black character who's the bad guy, and then the people who are pushing for the race swapping say, well, we can't have a black person being a villain. That's a trope. Well, Okay, so then who's it going to be? Well, it has to be the white guy. And you'll find out really quickly that when you're watching TV shows and movies, you're going to know who's going to live and who's going to die, who's good and who's bad within the first 10 minutes. It used to be that you wouldn't know. That if you sit back and you watch, it could be anybody. You might have a hint here or there, but you could toss, by writing the script well, you can toss the viewers a bone to get them to go down the trail a little bit. Turns out it's this other person's surprise, big reveal at the end. But, nowadays, it's just not going to happen. So if you see certain qualities displayed among a person, it's now going to be pretty much given that they're going to be okay. And it also kills any kind of character development too. One of the big things of a character in designing a character is going through what's known as the hero's journey. You have a basic opener where we get to know the person, and then something happens. There's some pivotal thing that happens that just sends them on the journey. And then as you go through the journey, you start having these little speed bumps that come along and setbacks, and they learn. And then here comes an older, wiser mentor who teaches them and guides them, and they keep going and going and going until finally get to the big thing at the end, the climax, where that person has to reach down and remember all of the things that their hero has been taught from the mentor. All of the bumps and bruises along the way come and have shaped this person to finally be ready for the big moment that they weren't ready for before. And then they overcome and win the day. The problem whenever you do a lot of race swapping, because we don't want to show people in different races having problems or issues because we're trying to show it in a virtuous way, the whole hero's journey, instead of a little chart of bumps and bruises, becomes just a straight line. They go from the initial setback where they were wronged, and they just spend the rest of the time just heading straight towards the climax with no setbacks. And the big reveal at the end is just that they were always a good person. They just had to realize it. So they don't ever have any kind of development. We never get to know any of their flaws because they can't have them. We don't get to see them mentored because, quite frankly, they're good enough already. They don't need a mentor, and the mentor is probably old and outdated anyway. And we just see them do this beeline to the climax, and there's no fulfillment. There's no rich storytelling that gets you into the idea of how important this work is. So the whole hero's journey has been killed by the idea of having to do this motion towards highlighting and promoting a race at the expense of others. Again, that makes for terrible, terrible storytelling. And then probably the biggest problem, and what you end up seeing in this is, when you start looking at their motivations and what it really exposes about them. So why would somebody do this kind of work? Well, again, some people think we just need to have more representation in movies and television, and that's the reason why. But the thing is, at the end of the day, if you read what a lot of these folks behind the scenes say, or what they, you read what they write or actually hear what they say, they'll say a lot of the reason why they do it is to follow what they call the anti-racist playbook, and that is to remove whites from any kind of prominence. So you see that kind of idea where we're just swapping just to erase white people, which is extremely racist. If you the easiest way to determine is this the right racist or not, just swap races around. What would happen if a white filmmaker decided to get rid of all black people in a story and make it strictly only whites, just for the sole purpose of getting rid of black people, make them the enemy, make them the problem, get rid of all of them? I mean, that sounds horribly racist too. So why is it good to do it the other way and noble, but racist to do it the other? It's not. It's racist both ways. So the problem is when, if you have a story and you have a well-written story and you start deviating it for some kind of political messaging or social engineering, that's when you start having problems. And you're going to create problems, because the big problem you're going to have from the beginning is, number one, there's a built-in fan base. And if you want to sell tickets to your movies or get people to watch your videos, your TV shows, you should always care about your fan base, because the people who love Harry Potter love it almost undyingly. But there's a line to be pushed, and we've found that line. And it's like you take a beloved character like Snape and change it just for the sake of social engineering, you've lost the plot and you've lost audience members. And the people who are tired of the past 6-7 years of seeing this happen, they're not going to tune in because they already know what's happening. Nope, we're done. Nope. And they won't tune in. So you just alienated a lot of audience. Why would you do that? This would be a super easy project for HBO to do if they did what they said and do a faithful adaptation and just followed it. There were already multi-ethnic characters in Harry Potter. Just redo it, and you're printing money. You know, you got the golden goose that's just pooping out eggs all over the place. You've got, all kinds of money just rolling in. And then you intentionally alienate your fans for this. Why? It just makes no financial sense. And it makes no sense from a storytelling standpoint. And, it just ends up damaging the product. It makes no sense. Now, probably the most egregious problem, and that is that it exposes the actual racism. And that is the racism that comes out of Hollywood. And what I mean by this is basically twofold. And that is, first of all, it starts the notion, and it screams the notion that there are no good multi-ethnic stories out there. It basically says only what's going to happen is if blacks are going to have a good story, or Hispanics are going to have a good story, or Asians are going to have a good story, it's going to have to be the white person's hand-me-downs. So we're going to take a white person's story and then just swap it, and now you have your own story. No, you just given them hand-me-downs. Think of the racism it takes to think that there are no good black stories. You're telling me in the entire history of the world, across the whole world, there are no good black stories? That doesn't make any sense. There have to be, but they're either too lazy to go look, or they just don't care, or they are working very diligently to erase white culture and whites from stories. And it could be a mix of all three. I don't doubt that it's a mix of all three, because developing stories takes time and work. And to travel the globe to find really good stories might take some time, and they don't want to spend that kind of time. But you look at a lot of stories that are typically told, they're ones that, they just took the time to stumble across and look and find a good story and say, this is something worth discussing. This is a great story. I love this story. Some of the best stories are just found by just having common interactions with people and hearing their tale, and then turning that into a book, turning it into a play, turning it into a TV show, turning it into a movie, whatever. No one is doing this for Hispanics, for blacks, for Asians. Well, why? It's insulting to them to say that, look, you have no culture, no stories worth telling. Therefore, we're only going to give you the white man's hand-me-downs. That's so insulting, and it's horrendously racist. And the only time you ever see any kind of storytelling, it's usually clownish, where they play up all the possible tropes, or it's incredibly nihilistic, where it's ugly and brutish and violent. It's like there are no good love stories. There are no good, adventure stories. Nothing like that at all. It's got to be clownish or nihilistic. Again, that's horribly racist. For Hollywood to be so lazy, so inept, and also so willing to eliminate white characters, it's a terrible thing that we should not be seeing. Find those stories. Get off your butts and go find those stories. There are lots of good stories all around the world that we've never found yet because you haven't bothered to go look. And you're too lazy to do so, and you're so captured by ideology that you don't want to go do so. So instead of looking for the next 007 who could possibly be black, or the next this character who could possibly be Hispanic, or the next this character who could possibly be Asian, or whatever you're trying to change, why don't you find an equivalent character and go from there. That's the problem with all the comic book industry. There's no need for them to do race swapping. There are already characters out there. So all of these superhero movies, there are tons of characters out there that you don't have to race swap. Just go pick one if you weren't so lazy and you weren't trying to eliminate them. So the big takeaway at the end of the day is, if you're going to tell a story, be faithful to the story. If you're going to insist on swapping a character's race, you need to be aware of how many implications there's going to be. This change for the HBO series for Harry Potter is going to be disastrous because it opens up tons of problems just by changing the race of a character. Tons of them. And that's not fair to Harry Potter fans. That's not fair to Papa Sweetu. But granted, he agreed to take the role, but still it puts him in a position where now he's in a very bad situation where they have to dance around his character and figure out how to make it work in the story. There are already options to make the story work. It was written out for you decades ago. That's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, I would appreciate any like, share, and subscribe you could give me. And if you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. I'm glad you stuck around this long anyway. But thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Communicology.